Welcome to Sidelined. I'm your host, Brian Lehman. We love sports, but what happens when we realize that there's a lot of ethical questions surrounding them? Enter Sidelined, a 4-episode series looking at various ethical issues around sports. Check out these samples from each of the 4 episodes and consider giving the full-length installments a listen. First up, Dr. Andrew Dunn of East Tennessee State University helps introduce the overall topic and talks about how media is involved with sports.
So there's still a lot of, areas where we feel like, I don't know if we can talk about it. Well, we should talk about this. We should talk about these things. And we should be a lot more open to talking about these things rather than just sticking our heads in the sand. I love sports, but at the same time, I know that there are some really, really shady stuff that happens in sports. And I have to think to myself, maybe I shouldn't be a sports fan. I don't know. It's a tough one. And it's one I think will be an eternal struggle for those of us who do want to think deeply. The sad thing is that's oftentimes what sports is supposed to be. I think a lot of those people who are saying shut up and play are the people who don't want to think about these things. They don't want to think deeply about it. They just want to watch. They just want to take 3 or 4 hours out of their life and lose themselves in a ball game and hopefully get that little spike of joy at the end if they win, right? And that little spark of joy if they lose, that little spark of, well, there's always the next game. There's always the next match. There's always next season. But I think it's worthwhile to think about these issues on a deeper level and to think about what it means and how can we help? Right. And that's really where, these conversations should lead is how can we help? What can we do next? How do we make football okay for my son to play and to be engaged in? How do we make sure that we don't have another false idol like Lance Armstrong? How do we make sure that women like Serena and Venus Williams are celebrated as much as the LeBrons and the Kobes and the Jordans? Like, how do we do that? I think those are worthwhile questions, and maybe even more important than the why we like this stuff and how do we make it better.
In the second episode, I'm joined by Jessica Luther and Kavitha Davidson, who co-authored a sports ethics book that proved to be the main resource for this podcast.
No matter what you're talking about, the reason it's difficult for us to talk about them is because of how sports fandom is formed. And she put it really well that, think about when you become a sports fan, think about how you become a sports fan. It usually happens much earlier in life than your other proclivities. It's usually childhood. It's usually has something to do with family or your hometown. And it's your identity, essentially. It really is impossible to extricate yourself from your sports fandom. So that's why when all of these things in sports are being challenged, it feels like you're being challenged. And that's why it's really hard to reconcile these dilemmas.
I mean, I'm a generational fandom. Like, I can't remember not watching football in my house, especially Florida State football. And it was just like part of what we did. And it was absolutely and part of the identity of the family. And it was painful. I don't really watch college football anymore. And it was like breaking up. Like, it was a painful thing to give it up. And I do understand when fans feel implicated when you point all this stuff out. And it goes back exactly to what Dr. Whitworn was describing in the book. I still think it's good for us. It's good to acknowledge that it's hard.
Next, local religious instructor Bill Haywood makes an appearance to help shed some light on the ethical issues of alcohol and gambling around sports.
Dr. John Kemp, Professor John Kemp from the University of Southern Illinois, he is probably the foremost expert on gambling in the United States of America. He literally wrote the book on casino gambling and online gambling, and he's been fighting against the problem of online gambling because they see where it goes. They found that all forms of gambling are actually a form of economic cannibalism. It hurts other businesses in one form or another because money that should be being spent on hamburgers are being spent on gambling. Money that should be spent on buying a new car is being spent on gambling. Well, sports betting is actually worse because they're inviting you to join them while you're sitting on your couch. You're not going out and spending that money. You're wasting that money while you're sitting on your couch. You're wasting that money, and it's going to somebody who knows where, and help the economy. It's going to help somebody's economy. It's going to help some wealthy people, but it's not going to help you, and it's not going to help the average person.
Finally, Professor Richard Sheehan of Notre Dame draws on his expertise in finance to discuss issues involving sports and money.
One of the things I looked at in the book that I wrote back in 1996, I asked the question there, how much do student athletes get paid on a per hour basis? So take the value of the scholarship and room and board and whatever else you want to throw in there, and then divide that by the number of hours that they either train or in some sense work for the institution. And in my calculations, the assumption that I made was if you graduate, then basically you're getting the value of the degree, which is measured by the cost of the degree. If you don't graduate, then what you're getting, you're playing for room and board. And at that point, there were a number of schools where football team might have a graduation rate of 20%. Notre Dame and programs like that, Duke, Northwestern, will have graduation rates of 95 plus. But when you start going through those calculations and ask, okay, how much do players get paid? The answer is that at most schools, they don't make the minimum wage.
That concludes this podcast preview. The complete episodes can be found on my personal YouTube channel. Thank you to all of my guests, as well as the faculty and advisors in the Department of Media and Communication at East Tennessee State University. I'm Brian Lehman, and thank you for listening.